Hello and welcome. This is Heavy Business. I'm Aaliyah,
And I'm Curtis.
and we have on our recurring co-host Ian Chainey from STEREOGUM. Thanks for coming back on the podcast, Ian.
Hello. Thank you for having me back.
It's a pleasure to have you. We always like having your insight. And today we're going to talk about how bands can max out on their next release, maximal promotion. And to start things off, I want to talk about interviews because that is one of the biggest ways that bands can get their message out, the story behind their music and their personalities out, and a way for people to connect with them. So I want to ask you, Ian, what do you think are some of the most important things to think about for bands when they're being interviewed? What are some things they should keep in mind?
First, before you do the interview, I think the most important thing is to figure out what the format is going to be because your approach to the interview is going to change depending on what that is. So if it's a written interview, it's going to be different than doing like a podcast. It's going to be different than doing like a video interview. So it's important to know what the format is. I would also recommend, if it's not stated in the interview request to begin with, to get a sense of what the context of the interview is going to be. Now, is this going to be like a lighthearted, funny interview? Is this going to be like a serious deep dive into your discography? Those are the two things I would try to find out up front. That's going to dictate what you do as far as the interview is going to be concerned.
One thing, though, too, that you should also do your best to make sure you know who you're talking to, because I've also seen it where bands will come on thinking they're talking to someone else than they are, which can be kind of embarrassing.
100%. 100%. Yeah, that's a great one as well. I'd also figure out what the website usually runs as far as interviews, like reading those and getting a feel for like what the style is, what the house style is with the interviews, because that's always an important thing. I remember I just recently interviewed Lee Aaron, and when I was doing the research phase of that, I read a bunch of interviews previously that Lee Aaron, the Queen of Canada, did. And there was one where the guy in the margins of the interview, like, put a bunch of her photos and did like hubba hubba captions under them. And this was like a through line for every single interview he did. And I was like, man, good thing to know beforehand if you want to accept that interview. But yeah, that's kind of the stuff you want to look out for.
Cringe. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a really good point. You can always look up the publication and or the person that you're interviewing with. You can check out interviews they've done in the past to get a feel for their personality and how they approach things. And of course, you can also always ask questions. I know we've talked sometimes about how a band should have like one go-to person for their interviews, the person that's good at being interviewed. Say they're not the songwriter or they don't write the lyrics or whatever. What are some things that it's important for them to know before going into the interview?
Well, I think the most important thing is to have the voice of the interviewer align with what the voice of the band is intended to be. So if you're like a super serious, self-serious black metal band, if you just have like the goofy guy do your interviews, like that's going to cause some cognitive dissonance. Although I would enjoy that. Like I don't think that's doing much for your image. And so having those two things align is probably the most important thing. Then next on that is just being able to feel the general questions that you're probably going to receive, like why did you write this song? Where do you get your ideas from? So on and so forth. That seems to be like kind of like the bread and butter of a lot of interviews. And again, that's really going to depend on what the format of the interview is. Just to go back on that, like when I write a lot of profiles, I ask a lot of general questions. I'm trying to find a through line that I can build a profile around. That's going to be different than doing like a straight Q&A. It's also gonna be different than doing like a podcast where you can kind of show off more of your charisma and what you got going on as far as like jokes are concerned. And like another thing is going to be like if you're doing the written word type stuff, like 90% of the time, any jokes you have are not going to land.
That's fair. That's fair. I was just thinking on the spot, if a band is going to be doing both written interviews and video or podcast interviews, would it maybe be a good idea to do the written interviews first to get answers to those basic questions kind of filled out in their minds so they have that for reference?
That can work, but some bands it doesn't really work for. Like sometimes it loses the spontaneity. I can't speak today. If you do something like that, but it depends. Like some people are good with prep like that. Some people aren't. Some bands do really well with written interviews. Some bands do really well with podcast interviews. Some bands are horrible at written interviews. And we have certain bands I would not give a written interview to, or we have, because they can't do it. Like they are awful at communicating and writing. But if you put them in front of a camera or you put them on a microphone, great, right? So it kind of depends on the person, and obviously not all bands are going to be the same. But some bands you do not want to have touch a written interview with a 10-foot pole. Reversely, some bands you don't want to have to in person or audio interviews because they are horrible at that. So it depends on the band. It depends on the personality. And I cut Ian off, I think.
No, I totally agree with you. It's really going to come down to like which you're most comfortable responding in. I think the benefit of doing written interviews is that you have way more control over them because number one, you're going to see all the questions up front. Number two, like you can edit your answers. Like you can't really do that on a podcast unless you're really friendly with the host and be like, hey, cut this so I don't sound like a complete moron. Especially if you're going to be doing like super like off the cuff stuff. So also, again, not to beat this dead horse as far as format is concerned, but if your stuff is going to appear in print, I almost prefer doing written interviews because it just reads so much better.
Depends on the band, but it's
Sure.
easier on the journalist.
Yep. I mean, goes both ways, I think. I think having the control over the interview is an interesting uh, quirk as far as the written interview is concerned. But again, yeah, different strokes for different folks on that one.
And just to clarify real quick, what he's talking about, I think, is like sometimes you will see an interview in print that was conducted over the phone, and then the journalist is transcribing what the artist said. And you're saying, which I totally agree with, you would prefer to just start with a written interview and have it written out to begin with and have that like control over what you're saying.
Yeah, if you're the person being interviewed, in some cases, I think that's going to be best, especially if you're going to be talking about like super complex topics or contentious stuff. Possibly, I think you want to have more control of your answers than not in those cases. But it's also going to depend on the interviewer making sure that they transcribe stuff correctly if you're doing it over the phone to make sure that your ahs and ums are not there, and to also ensure that they're doing right by you to make sure that everything makes sense, which is can be something that I don't see from young journalists when they're just transcribing interviews. So
Yeah, because to be fair, like a lot of times when we're talking, we might leave out a word or skip around our thought a little bit. And when you're talking, you can understand it, but when it's written down, it looks silly. So
yeah,
I just wanted to point out this one thing is make sure when you're doing an interview that you're not going in there combative or that you're not going in there sounding super bored. One issue that when I used to do interviews a long time, well, I kind of do this on here, but you know what I mean? One problem would be a band would have like 10 interviews in one day. They get to you and now they're bored. They don't really want to talk. You kind of have to fake it anyways because you're being interviewed for a publication. So you got to kind of have that attitude that this is your first interview of the day. You want to be there. You're actually promoting your band. Because if you're just sitting there going like, I don't want to do this, fuck off, you're not going to look very good, and no one is going to like you as a result of that. So I just wanted to say that part.
any other tips for bands on how to max out the potential of their interviews? Curtis,
I got one more.
you raised his hand.
I did raise my hand. One thing I wanted to point out, because you mentioned this earlier, Ellie, about if the person being interviewed is not the main songwriter or whatever. I think that needs to be, a lot of times that needs to be made clear to the interviewee. I'm sure the interviewer was like, oh, duh, didn't even think about that type of thing.
Well, and that's what I was kind of pointing out is that
Yeah,
maybe the person being interviewed has a bit of a responsibility to talk to the songwriter ahead of time and
exactly.
understand certain things
Yeah,
in case those questions are asked.
exactly. Or the interviewer should do enough investigative journalism beforehand to know who they're talking to and their role in the band too. It goes both ways. It does go both ways,
It
but
does, but at the
yeah,
same time, I feel like an interesting interview is going to be about the story of the album. And
totally.
so if you want to give an interesting interview, then you need to know what the story of the album is.
100%. 100%. But either way, just make sure you either know something about it or that you know who you're talking to if you're doing the interview. And then one other thing I just wanted to go over for interview tips as well is also um, if you get asked to do a podcast interview, make sure you know if it's video or audio only. Because one thing that'll happen sometimes is the interviewer will not make it clear that it's video, especially who want to do makeup will then come on not realizing that they were supposed to be in makeup or something like that. And it becomes a big hassle for everybody involved. So one thing I always like to do is find out, is this interview going to be video or audio only?
Yeah, I like the idea of not being combative. I think it's important to kind of match the energy of the person that's doing the interview with you. I think that tends to lead to the best results. I think, the advice that I got when I started doing podcasts a long time ago is be yourself plus a little bit more. And that usually, makes it seem like a more gregarious version of yourself. One of the things that, in our space in metal writing, rarely are we doing like adversarial journalism. It's usually going to be like access based. But still, even with that in mind, I wouldn't say anything that you're not prepared to defend or back up or have fact checked.
What do you mean by that? Just to clarify, because that could go a long ways.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to say something that's going to be controversial, you know, be prepared to offer some defenses and possibly rebuttals if you're going to say that thing. One of the interesting cause and effect with that is like what Glenn Benton has had to go through in the past few years, where he
Oh,
was
yeah.
a very interesting uh, interview subject in the 90s, and he's still having to answer for a lot of the stuff he said in interviews in the 90s. Like, hey, how come you didn't put yourself like you promised to do that? And he's like, man, that was like taken out of context like years and years and years ago. And he's still having to answer those questions over and over and over. So I what you say is gonna live for a long, long time. So I don't want to make people feel nervous about doing interviews because I think the best kind of interviews are candid and kind of off the cuff. That's usually where you get the most interesting answers. But just keep it in mind that stuff on the internet lasts a long, long time.
Yeah, and that is what is so anxiety inducing about interviews, honestly.
Yeah, I mean the saying goes like dance like nobody's watching, but whatever you say, pretend it's going to be read at a deposition.
Excellent. Yeah.
I love that.
Anything else on interviews before we go into part 2 and 3?
My last thing as a tip to bands is do not turn down interviewing anyone if you are new, or being interviewed rather by anyone if you are new. Um, Obviously, if it's like some sort of controversial publication, different story. But one thing I've seen sometimes with newer clients is they will turn down interviews by new publications or smaller publications because they're too small. But the problem is you need that practice and you need to get some credits behind you before anyone else will interview you. It builds up your resume and it also helps you with your SEO in the long run as well. So just take whatever you can. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe only 3 people are going to read it. But right now, you're not getting any interviews yet. Roll with it. Practice with it. It's like playing a show. A lot of times you're going to play to 3 people. So that's my last tip.
Yeah, I agree with that. Getting the reps in is really important. And one thing you can do to prepare, like, do the same thing that presidential candidates do to prepare for debates. Just have your own bandmates interview you.
That is a good idea.
That is a good idea. How should bands handle it if an interviewer gets confrontational and says insulting things about your album in the interview?
It really depends. I mean, if it, like what is the context for the confrontation? I guess Because if they're being like so out of pocket and rude to you, I would just walk
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah. Yep. My own opinion is it can go one of two ways. Like, how is it set? So if it's confrontational, like you said, walk. Just walk. Because that person is just they're just trying to get a rise out of you, and they're probably going to be using you for clickbait. So just walk. They're probably going to also call you an asshole and take you walking out of context anyways, but that's better than being caught out saying something stupid and then being put on the record for it later, because it is what it is. So if they're being confrontational and they're just trying to get a rise out of you, get out of there as quickly as you can. Let your PR person know or your manager know what happened, so that way if they do try to come after you with something, they know what happened. You got your bases covered already. Reversely, though, if someone makes a comment that they didn't like something about your album, isn't the same as being confrontational. Like if it's coming up like, I noticed the mix was different. I thought it sounded a little bit muddy this time around or something like that. I wouldn't personally take that as being confrontational. But, you kind of got to distinguish between the two. So if they're being like really combative and they're like insulting you, saying something bad about the album, just get out. Right? But it takes judgment.
The other thing that you can do, which is a CYA measure, is that if you know the interview is going to be recorded, even for transcription purposes, ask for the recording or do a
Yep.
recording yourself to make
Yep.
sure that if it comes out later and they miss the context, you have the receipts on that.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. So we got to move on because we spent a good amount of time talking about that. The next segment of this is points 2 and 3. So we're talking like top 3 tips on how to max your release promotion. And the next 2 are kind of lumped together: video content and social media content. For this segment, I actually dug into one of my favorite bands who has done super well independently. I went onto their YouTube channel and I looked at every single video that they released in promotion of their latest album. And this is Shadow of Intent and their album Elegy, which came out January 14th of 2022. And just for a little frame of reference, they had 6 promotional videos on their YouTube channel before the album release. And then they had an additional 7 videos actually, additional 7 videos in promotion of that album after the release. They really did like a sandwich sort of deal.
It looks like it was actually 1 year long in total for the campaign, if I'm looking correctly.
Yeah, and it was a whole year. Yep. They started 3 months before. Started 3 months before, and then they continued that cycle for an additional 9 months after.
Yep.
I think a couple observations that are great to take away from this. Their first video release was a full music video. That was the album announcement with a music video. And then about a month later, they released a second single. This had an animated stream, so it doesn't have to be a music video every time, although music videos definitely do the best. You can do other types of content. Then they had a behind-the-scenes video. Then they had another video for single 2 that was a drum playthrough. Then they had another behind-the-scenes video, and then they had, on album release day, a third single drop with a music video. So the album announcement, release day, and then 2 more music videos after that. So 4 total music videos, and then some other types of promotional content outside of that. Why do you think this type of release campaign is successful? And what can bands take away that they should try to... What are their key takeaways from it? Like, other than just kind of trying to copycat the whole thing, like what the principles to take away from it? Just quick clarification.
Okay.
They had 6 singles in total, 3 before, 3 after, and they had a max of 2 videos for each associated with any one song.
So they're doing 2 pieces of content per, and then they're also doing the behind the scenes. Either way, that's still multiple pieces of content. And you could do even more if you felt like it. Like you could do like a guitar playthrough, drum playthrough, vocal takes, all sorts of different things if you felt like it, right? I've seen some bands do that. I wish I could remember, but there was one fairly recently where they had like, I think it was like 6 pieces of content for one song. It was crazy.
I don't know if I think that's a good idea or
I
not.
don't either,
I
but
think that
I'm
people
just
might get
saying
tired of it. Which
Yeah,
is
I
why I
don't
think
know.
this might be kind of a sweet spot. It's like you do a stream release and then you do one instrument playthrough
Yeah,
and then you do a different stream release and then you
exactly.
do, yeah.
Yeah, but it's multiple pieces of content for each one, right? So I don't know how that one band did, but I'm just like saying it can happen, right? But one other thing I just wanted to point out with this is that one thing that you also said is that they put it appears to me, unless I'm misreading this, they did the music video first, and then they always did a playthrough next. I've seen bands do the playthrough first, and then the videos next. I've never really thought that made much sense, but I think that's a key point too, is that you have the song out first, and then you do the playthrough versus doing the playthrough, then the video, because I have seen that before.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to leak who the band is, but of course, this is the rollout for the Kids Bop version of Tomb of the Mutilated that they did for Cannibal Corpse. So, yeah, Uh, no, I really like the timing of this because, like Curtis said, I think getting the video out first is really important because that's content that's more primed to be aggregated by different websites, which helps get the word out. And I love putting the video out the day that the album's going to be released because that really keeps that fresh in everyone's mind. Like, hey, this thing is coming out today. Here's another song. So yeah, they really nailed it with the scheduling, I feel.
Yeah, and I did notice that after they released the album, they didn't have any, the only videos released were either making of or music videos or a playthrough. There weren't any like animated streams or lyric videos or any of those sort of lower tier releases associated with the songs because I think that when it comes to after the release, people can hear the song anywhere. And so you really need to have a value add to get people to watch the video.
Well, I think, and there are different ways you could do a value add on the video. Like, let's say if you wanted to do like an animated lyric video, that could work, right? Could. It depends. Or a live clip can sometimes work as well.
I think that works if you're debuting the song because you really want to get
Yeah.
the most bang for your buck when you put that stuff out there. Because like if you already have the video out, like Metal Injection is not going to write about doing a lyric video or a playthrough video for that song that you already did.
Let me ask you this though. So I agree with you, but it can work for bigger bands. So I'm kind of wondering why couldn't it work for smaller bands? Like Metallica does that type of stuff.
Because you know why it doesn't work for smaller bands. For those
Yeah.
listening, it's because publications do not care about smaller bands that much. So you have to give them something to talk about.
You do.
I feel
You
like it's
always
not
do.
just publications. It's like it's social media. A lot of the time, if you're a smaller band, it just feels like you're just shouting into the void this stuff.
Yep. A lot of bands do try to market themselves, like base their marketing off of like the Spirit Boxes and the Metallicas of the world. We actually had a client at one point a few years ago, or couldn't have been that long ago, because they were talking about Spirit Box, and they wanted to model their whole strategy off Spirit Box. And it was a debut, and they tried it. I mean, it worked somewhat, but I mean, it wasn't quite as successful as they thought it was going to be, right? And they kind of weren't really sure why. But the thing with bands like Spirit Box who do stuff like that is that they already had members that were in a famous band prior to that. It was I Wrestled the Bear Once, I think is what it was. So these are types of things you got to think of when you're modeling other strategies too. So like, yes, they were a newer band, but they were also in I Wrestled the Bear Once.
How long before the album release do you want to start telling people that you have a new album?
So I think that for smaller bands, the pattern that I typically see is 3 to 6 months, depending on the time of year. What do you think, Ian? You're the journalist.
I mean, I would prefer that you have the album in the can and it's ready to go, so you avoid like a Winter Sun situation where it's like 10 years later and everyone's just like, "Where's the album at, dude?" Yeah, if it's mixed and mastered, let's talk about it. But I wrote a thing about Anata a long time ago, and they're just like, "Oh, we just have to master the album." It's like, cool, all right, that's gonna come soon. It's like 7 years later, still not here, still have no idea what the activity is in that band even. So yeah, could really catch yourself in a lurch if you don't have something to present the public pretty soon after you say you have a new album, I feel.
It depends on like if you're actually announcing the album, yeah. But if you're doing like the single release strategy, like Ludovico Technique did a really good campaign. Lasted about I think a year and a half. But if I recall correctly, he didn't actually announce the album until almost a year later. But he was releasing all the singles up to it, right? So I think
Yeah,
if you
that
do
is a
something
different
like that,
strategy.
yeah, yeah,
That is a different strategy, just releasing standalone singles without
yeah,
any mention of an album,
yeah,
which I
exactly.
do
That's
see
what I
some
mean.
smaller bands doing. They will release just an independent standalone single,
Yeah,
and then maybe that might be a year before their next album comes out, and
yeah.
then they might release another single, and then eventually when the album comes out, that standalone single is also on the album. You still almost have to have the album ready to go before you start that strategy, or you need to know that you're going to be mixing and mastering with that same person or something, because otherwise the sound is going to be inconsistent from the standalone single to the album.
Yeah, I agree. I think you just want to have the album pretty much ready to go before you start doing this stuff. I think you can do like announcements like we're in the studio to kind of like tease that something's on the way, but I would still prefer if we're gonna start releasing stuff that the album's almost in hand or, pretty much done. I guess my question for both of you is, are we out of the era where we're doing the surprise drop?
I hate the surprise drop. It
I
doesn't
hope
work for
so.
PR. It doesn't work for PR as a general rule. I've seen a couple bands do it, but yeah, it's not really something that's really recommended. Well, it never was. Like the issue is like you can do a surprise drop if you're known, or at least you could do a surprise drop if you're known. I think it was Avenged Sevenfold that did a big surprise drop and then it just flopped. The issue is like if nobody knows who you are, it's there's no point in doing the surprise drop. You might as well hype it up, try to get some listeners. Surprise drops as a general rule don't work.
I think the only instance it can work in our sphere is that if you're a legendary band and you've had 10 or more years off, but you have your PR person get in touch with all the magazines a month ahead of time and say, hey, this is coming on such and such a date. Don't leak this as public. We're going to drop it on this date. It's going to be a surprise drop. But at least they have everything ready to go. I think it can kind of work if you coordinate it like that. But that is a lot of variables that have to work in your favor to make that
I
work.
think someone like Slayer could probably have that work if they decided to do a new album. They could probably
Yeah.
have something like that work. But other than that, I don't really know of too much other than like major bands that would really work for. But
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the Shadow of Intent release strategy, they had a shorter period of time leading up to the album, but then they continued to promote that album for months and months and months after it, which is maybe your logical argument for the surprise drop is, oh, I don't want to promote it till it's out there, but you still need to promote it a little bit beforehand.
well, no one will review the album if you're well, just period almost like if unless it's a new thing. It's just the way it works. So that is a definite problem with doing the surprise drop. Is that you're not going to get any reviews unless like you're a major band. Like if Slayer decided to surprise drop an album, everybody's going to review it just because it's Slayer. That is a good point. Is that most bands do not promote enough after they've dropped the album because there is all this content that you could be doing, like the Shadow of Intent thing. Like if they did a full year of promo, like I'm sure that helped their sales and I'm sure it helped their touring opportunities as well because they always had this fresh content going out. So yeah, you can say I'm not going to get any reviews, and that might be true, but you could still get YouTube plays. You can still get social media likes and stuff and shares from that. You can get some new fans from it. And yeah, it's time consuming, but I mean, playthroughs aren't that expensive to do. You can easy to film. Most people don't like lyric videos, but it is something that you can do if you want to get some content as long as it's well done. But yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do after the album to promote it as well, but you do need that pre-push pretty heavily in order to actually get media attention.
Yeah, you can crowdsource a lot of live clips from people nowadays as well to make a video.
Yep. Yeah, live clips could actually be pretty good if they are high quality. But that's another problem is like you got to be careful on the quality. Like one thing that Aaliyah's always always has said on this podcast is you got to have high quality content, and she's right on that. Because if you're just there are some people that just say push out whatever content you can, and I can see that argument a little bit, but you want to try to strive for quality content at the same time. Like especially if it's something that's already released, you've already did the promo cycle on, and you're trying to back it up. Just throwing anything out just to see if it sticks is a dumb move, and I honestly think you should be focusing on higher quality stuff.
I agree. Yeah, if you have the fire hose on at all time, it's kind of like when you don't put a battery in the smoke alarm.
Yeah,
Like you pay attention to it for a day, and then like a week later, like you don't even hear it anymore.
exactly. It's just noise coming up because I've seen bands put up like awful quality live clips just to keep some promotion going, and it's like that doesn't look very good. Like if you got like this crappy recording, or it looks like it was filmed on like a 1987, video camera or something like that, it's stupid. It does do more harm than good, in my opinion.
So here's another question I have. In the age of the internet, when everything is eternal, especially on streaming sites where your stuff isn't going to live on Spotify forever, people can always hear it. How long is the album cycle now?
You mean the pre-promo or what?
I mean, way after it's out. I mean, are you just doing promo for that for like time immemorial just because like it's always out there?
This is an interesting argument that I've heard recently that I don't necessarily know. Like, someone was telling me not that long ago that they thought that like some of their super older songs should still be promoted. I don't think anybody's really going to care too much about a song from 2005. Like, we actually had someone submit the C Squared playlist with a song from 2009 recently. And I looked at that and I'm like, I can't put this on a playlist. It's from 2009. I didn't even listen to the song, but at the same time, I was like, well, why not? Right. But like the reason why, in my opinion, is because there's so much new music being released. It's why would I push someone's song from 2009? It just doesn't make any sense to me unless it's somehow repackaged and made new. Like, I don't know, you need a gimmick of some sort in order to keep it alive. But reversely, at the same time, like, I mean, Master of Puppets became popular again, 3 years ago with Stranger Things. So, I mean, there's that argument as well, is that you can promote an older song and make it somewhat new again. So, I don't know.
So in that case, it kind of depends on the channel, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to like pitching songs for TV placements or video game placements, I think you can do that forever. Absolutely,
Probably.
for time
Yeah.
immemorial. But when it comes to pitching to Spotify playlists and pitching to, or like running Facebook ads or Meta ads or YouTube ads or something like that, that might be a little more up in the air. And I'm not really sure about all of that.
Yeah, I'm not either. Like, promoting a song from 5-6 years ago when you got other material, like, I don't know. Like, if you're re-releasing it, sure, but I don't know. It is a weird one, and I'm not sure where you're going with this.
One thing I do think, really quick, one thing I think I may have seen, I just suspect this because I don't know that these bands are doing it, but sometimes right before a band is going to release something new, they might promote something old and get that to get a lot of traction and get people like checking out their channels. I see this on YouTube particularly. And then suddenly they've released something new. And because you watched a video of theirs recently, it gets put into your algorithm.
I could see that. Depends on how old it is, I guess, too. But I mean, like, if it's from your last album, I could see that making sense.
The reason I want to bring up just the eternalism in music is just I think we're in a brand new territory as far as different digital platforms such as like TikTok, where that seems to be so algorithmically heavy as far as promoting stuff that can really make stars of the bands that are like long forgotten. Like I think of the case of Duster, who was kind of like an afterthought in the early '90s, is now like the most popular shoegaze band, and that is strictly because shoegaze TikTok picked them up, and it just spread like wildfire throughout the platform. So because your music is always going to be out there, I'm always kind of interested, like, what do you do about that? Because like gone are the days where you have like a 1 year album cycle because you know that your stuff is not going to be on the record store shelves for for very long. It's going to get traded out for the new thing. You're no longer will be in the Best Buy circular. You only have like a limited time to really make the public interested in that. Like that's not the case anymore.
That is true, yeah, and I guess we have to figure out what to do about that. I mean, bands will you can always post on social media about your old content on the anniversaries of the content, or if you have a live clip that's really good, or if you have just some kind of throwback fun fact about the filming of the music video or something like that. I don't know. I guess we have to play around with that and see what we can do with that in mind. Do you have any advice, Ian?
What I don't like is when a new member comes to the band and then they re-record the old stuff with the new member. It's like, what are we doing? What are we doing?
Yeah, I agree. The only time I would say it's like a little different, it's not exactly the same thing, is if you have like a big concert and you do a live album from that concert and that has like a lot of material from your new release, but it might have some old content as well, old songs as well. In that case, I think that's totally valuable, but that's a big exception.
Yeah, I mean, like re-recorded albums in general. I strain to think of times that's worked out. Like the Cavalera stuff has been super dope. I think that's one such case where that's worked, but that's a special band in and of itself that has extreme familiarity with the old material, and it's like the old guys still doing it. But yeah, yeah, not a strategy that I would recommend.
I think you're right. Cavalier Conspiracy is probably the only band that's successful with.
Well, before we run out of time, I want to go a little bit over social media because we talked about all this video content and how you can start your promo cycle and run it for a really long time. I just want to talk about the amount of social media posting that should be done in theory for each song. Like, I feel that for each music video that you release, you should have like 2 or 3 reels that you post about it, or like you should have enough social media directing people to your YouTube page or your streaming page surrounding that. So maybe sandwiching that, like approaching each single as almost like the mini version of the album. Like you do a couple, maybe one post before, post day of, couple posts a day after. I don't know. What are your thoughts about this, Ian, and then Curtis?
Huh, yeah, I mean, it's tough because you wanna make sure that your stuff is seen above the constant ebb and flow of social media because there's just like so much stuff out there. Like you don't want to be lost in the mix. So like I get the interest of like constantly posting, but I think again this just comes back to making sure that your posts are like quality posts, like you said. And I think quality is ultimately going to rule the day in that respect. Like that's cream is always going to float to the surface, right? Not to steal a quote from
From you,
yeah,
you say that like every episode that we
yeah,
do with you.
from the legendary Macho Man Randy Savage. May he rest in peace. Uh, yeah, and it's I guess figuring out what that strategy is going to look like is going to be like the most important thing. Like the thing that seems to get the most traction from smaller bands on my social media feed, at least, is when the album comes out, they do a song by song breakdown. It's like, here's what this song is about. Here's what we're going for. Here's some behind the scenes stuff on that. Like people seem to really like that because it makes the album more personalized and it kind of like humanizes the album a little bit. So it's like these aren't like robots just going to the studio. Like they had like real thoughts and real needs and real desires as far as making this album was concerned.
In my own opinion, I think what you said, like usually 3 posts approximately. Depends though, because obviously Twitter and Threads are going to be a bit different. It's a lot harder to be seen on those 2 platforms unless you're posting a little bit more frequently, just because of the way the algorithm works. So with Twitter, I would say you'd have to do a fair amount more of talking about it than you would on Instagram, for example, because with Instagram, the more you post, the more you're going to get buried in the feed. But everybody hates it when I say this, but honestly, one of the best ways to get your music heard via social media is to DM your followers and ask them to check out the song with a nice message, not a spammy message. Just saying, hey, look, I know you follow my page. Just letting you know we have a new track out. You can check it out here and here. If you want to check it, awesome. If not, cool. Or here's a Bandcamp download code for me. No problem if you're not interested. That takes time. You got to limit it to, I think, something like 30 posts every couple hours, but it's actually really effective. And if you do it properly and politely with people, that's the most effective way that I personally know of to actually get your music heard on social media.
Right on. And I mean, all of these things, it's important to avoid what Ian mentioned earlier is that fire hose of
Yeah.
posting too much. And you need to find that balance for your audience, for your platforms, and just try to keep things balanced. And one final thing that's kind of on my mind is like what bands should be doing on social media in between releases if they don't have anything going on. I've brought this up a couple times recently, um, because you don't really want to be posting like, oh, we're demoing new songs or writing new songs. It's like, it's way too early to be talking about that stuff if you're just at that phase, in my opinion. So I honestly think it might be better to just go silent on social media personally, but I know Curtis doesn't agree with that.
Well, I don't necessarily not, to be honest. My viewpoint is if you don't have anything to post, don't post. But I think you should still be active on social media, as in like talking to people and in that regard. But I agree with you that posting for the sake of posting doesn't make any sense. I used to have a little bit of a different opinion on that, I will admit, but I don't see the point of it but like, if you want to post about your dog going to the studio with you, cool. Just don't make that your everyday thing. I've seen people do that just for the sake of putting a post out there. But again, obviously remind people that you're there, maybe post once a week or every 3 weeks or something like that. And say like, here's a throwback to when we did this, or here's a clip of our song or something. But you want to be mainly talking to people. Twitter is a good place to do that. Threads is a good place to do that. Even on Instagram comments, just staying in touch with people or just saying hi to people in DMs works. But I actually agree with you, believe it or not. I don't think you should be posting for the sake of posting.
I concur with Curtis. I think you get a lot of work done just in the replies. Or if somebody asks you a question like, hey, you're working on new stuff, you can say like, yeah or no.
Or even just like commenting on other bands that you know, and you're like actually commenting. There's a certain person that I saw make a video recently that said, go to comments and just do that to get attention. No, you don't want to do that. The reason why you're doing it is because you want to interact with people and make people realize that you're still there while also participating in the scene. It's a give and take. It's not just a look at me, and look at me, throwing up fire emojis just so people know that you're around type of thing. But I mean, it can be effective, but that's not what you want. Like, you want to be authentic on these types of things, right?
I agree. I do, however, like it when bands pop up on like the certain meme accounts and like there's the classic crazy moments in new metal history. And whenever other bands I follow pop up and like say like, oh yeah, I love this band, I love seeing that video. Like, cool, love it. We have something that we can relate over. I like it.
So yeah, those are the top three things that we wanted to talk about today. Interviewing, video content, and social media.
I think I just want to reiterate one point. A lot of people keep complaining that no one's seeing their posts. The key is to be active and interested yourself in what the other bands are doing and the other people in your scene are doing. And again, this isn't being done as a tactic. It's because you actually want to, connect with people. If you're doing this as a tactic, it's not going to work because everybody's going to eventually find out that you're being insincere. So that's why it doesn't work for a lot of people. You have to be social and you have to be genuine about it. That's my main takeaway.
My big addition to all this is one of the things that I see people run into in all three of these categories that we talked about today is they want to make sure that they're doing something that's going to be like smart and has been like they're treading new ground. And I think it's also important just in a lot of instances to make the subtext just the text. Like state what you're going to do plainly and honestly, and usually that's going to look the best, especially if you're doing like interview stuff. From the writer's side, what I found it to be interesting is that I will take if somebody says something extremely plain, I will use that more often than not if they're going to say something that's extremely clever because you're able to build a piece around that stuff much easier than you are with something that's going to be like too clever by half or buried in all kinds of like different kind of abstraction. So don't be afraid to make the subtext the text.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ian, for coming on and talking about this with us. And everyone listening, thanks for listening. And until next time, make like a bull and throw those horns up.